Hi, I'm Greg Giusti with the University of California's Division of Ag and Natural Resources, a part of that division of Cooperative Extension. I'm an advisor in Lake and Mendocino counties. I've been asked today to come and share some thoughts with you on the impact of the current California drought on wildlife. Certainly all of us hear every day impacts of the drought on people, on the environment. This is a chance for me to share with you some thoughts on how drought can and will affect a whole host of different wildlife animals here in the state. Obviously, part of living in California is enjoying the diversity of wildlife that we get to see on a daily basis, even in urban environments as well as wildland environments. And the drought, the lack of water, affects all organisms, just like it does people. So today is a chance to share some thoughts, give you some concepts, and give you an opportunity to think about what's happening out in the natural environment here in the state. Not all species respond identically to various stresses. As you might have noticed in my title slide, I talked about drought as being an insidious stress. It is somewhat treacherous. It's somewhat hidden. We're not going to go out and find animals just dying on the street. However, it is a stress factor on these animals that are already, in some cases, living in a stressful environment. Some species can be acutely impacted by the drought, and the example I throw up here is dealing with migratory waterfowl. Here in a couple of months, there will be literally 1 million birds, waterfowl, shorebirds, and the like, coming into California and moving into the Central Valley to spend the winter. In a normal winter, when there's lots of water, lots of flooded fields, those birds are able to disperse over a large area. In drought months, or in drought situations like we have today, all of those birds are going to be crowded into smaller areas. And as you know, as you read, anytime you get a lot of poultry together, they are susceptible to disease. Most striking in contaminated water, again, 100,000, 200,000 birds all living in the same water, feeding and disposing of their waste in that water. Over time, the loss of dilution from rain can cause problems, particularly with avian botulism and avian cholera. So, and in those kind of situations, we can have acute responses where literally hundreds, if not thousands of organisms can die in a very short period of time, a matter of weeks. In most cases, that's not the case of what we're going to see as the result of the drought. Some species, and the examples I've given you here are amphibians. You know, most people love to see frogs and newts, and they make kids squeal, and kids will catch pollywogs and put them in a jar during the summer and watch them grow. These are animals that have to have water to complete their life cycle. And in the longer that the drought continues, the more stress and the more inability that these organisms have on reproducing. And so what happens is that over time, animals, as nature calls, will die, but there will be a lack of recruitment, new animals coming into the population. And over time, a couple of years, 3 years, the additive impacts of lack of reproduction can cause local populations to go extinct. All animals have basic needs. We call that habitat. Habitat has 4 main components: food, water, cover, and space. Food and water are pretty obvious. Different animals can access water in different ways. Large animals like deer need free water. They need to be able to go drink water like a dog or a cat. Many other organisms like mice can find a dewdrop in the morning, which will meet their water needs, or oftentimes many rodents can get the moisture they need from the grasses or the seeds that they're eating. Cover is important, and especially in the middle of summer where it's hot and it's dry, animals simply have to get out of the elements. They have to get out of the weather, whether it's shade in the summer or whether it's wind. It's another component of allowing animals. It's another element out there that allows animals to stay in the environment 12 months of the year, every day of the week. And then space just has to do with how much room an individual species might need. Simple concept: a little deer mouse is going to need less space to find food, water, and cover than, say, something like a mountain lion. So the behavior of how these animals respond to meeting their basic needs is directly tied to the quality and availability of their habitat. It's a word we hear a lot about, and it's really the basis of what allows animals to live in a particular area. The other thing I want to talk on, another concept I want to share with you, is this notion of ecosystem functionality or ecosystem function. The habitat has to work in a certain way to allow a number of animals to live together, to share space. We call it partitioning resources. And the ability of these animals to sustain themselves throughout the year is based on the functions and flows of the habitat. Certain kinds of functions are soil and water interactions or migratory pathways. They're things that allow the animal to live in a particular area or over the course of a landscape. Things like flows or water flows and nutrient flows, how nutrients move through a system, how the grass gets converted to food and how the food gets converted to waste and how the waste gets converted back into the soil and the system starts over again. So functions and flows are very important in how habitat works. The other important consideration when we talk about habitat is both the structure of the habitat and the composition of that habitat. Structure has to do with, do you have bushes, do you have shrubs, do you have trees, do you have rocks, do you have cliffs? All of these different nooks and crannies allow different animals to exploit a particular area. The composition of the habitat, do some trees produce acorns, do some trees produce berries, do some bushes produce berries? These are other elements that an animal can exploit throughout different times of the year. For example, everybody knows that deer and squirrels like to eat acorns. Acorns are a seasonal food item. They show up and they become available September, October. By March and April, they're gone. So there has to be other things in the system that allow these animals to find nutrients and to sustain themselves until the next acorn crop. All of these things come into play and it allows what we call for a carrying capacity, how many kinds of one particular kind of animal can live in one place at one time. That can also change with the concept of succession. We know that plant communities, it's like living in a video, it's not a snapshot. After a fire, for example, the trees are burned, the brush is burned, all the vegetation's close to the ground. It's called an early cereal stage. There are certain animals, many little passerine birds, sparrows and the like, that will readily utilize those early cereal stages. Deer will use those early cereal stages because they can reach the food, it's on the ground. Over time, as that habitat grows and matures, trees come back, different kinds of birds. Maybe it's not sparrows, maybe it's warblers now. They're using the tops of the trees. So the different stages of the habitat also describes what animals, what wildlife species can exploit it. Here's a picture of what habitat looks like. Habitat can look like anything. I often joke that suitable habitat for Brewer's blackbirds is the parking lot of your local supermarket. How many times have you seen blackbirds standing under cars on a hot summer day in the shade, cover? What do they want to do when they want food? They walk out from underneath the car and they jump up and pick the bugs off of your radiator grill. Food. And if they need water, maybe somebody spilled a Coke and there's some ice cubes melting or something. So anything can be habitat, but some animals have more restrictive habitat requirements. And like the picture I showed you here, things like mountain lions and deer, and you can see the Eel River going down in the bottom for salmon and steelhead. Certain animals are very narrow in their requirements. Other animals like Brewer's blackbirds are very opportunistic. Crows are very opportunistic. They can adapt to any type of habitat. In a wildland situation, as you look at this image here on your screen, you'll see that the habitat is a mix of different bits and pieces, different nooks and crannies. Over on the right-hand side, there's a rock and a cliff outcropping. Down in the bottom, there's Gary oaks. Up on the top, there's conifers. Along the riparian corridor, along the stream, maybe there's other kinds of hardwoods. So all of these components, all of these elements are working together to allow an organism to sustain itself throughout the year. When you talk about drought, really we're talking about weather. Climate is what shaped the vegetation communities in California. When we talk about climate, we're talking about long-term patterns of weather. California, we have what's described as a Mediterranean climate. Dry summers, relatively wet winters, very distinct wet and dry periods. That pressure over the last 5.5 million years has shaped where we find both giant sequoias and coastal redwoods in California. If you look here, this thin band of green right along the coast, all this back here is the continental United States. So if we look at the distribution of coast redwoods, these organisms are literally hanging on to the edge of the continent. They've been pushed to that based on the climate regime that they require. They're an organism that needs fog. They need moisture, and I'll explain why in a minute. Over in this area up here, these are the 70 or so groves of giant sequoias in the southern Sierras. Again, they're found in dark, cool places. 5.5 million years ago, sequoias, a different species of sequoia, was found in Montana and Wyoming. Over the course of millions of years and with the changing climates, and as climate has gotten warmer and drier, these organisms have retreated back to the only part of the continent that will allow their survival, areas that are relatively cool and damp. Climate has shaped the distribution of oaks in California as well. Oaks are a much newer arrival on the California scene. If we look at pollen deposits from places like Clear Lake, out in the Clear Lake muds in Lake County, we see that oaks really barged onto the scene about the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago. Prior to that time, the pollen record was heavily dominated by conifers. As the climate warmed, as the ice sheets receded, we got into what is our current Mediterranean type of climate, and oaks became the dominant tree form over much of the interior part of California. As I've said, this Mediterranean climate is found within particular regions of the globe, and there's about 5 other places: Australia, Chile, here in California, and the Mediterranean region of Europe and Northern Africa. We all share similar climate patterns: dry, hot summers, relatively wet winters. But this pattern, this Mediterranean pattern, has really shaped the kinds of major vegetation types, plant communities that we have here in California. Drought is a phenomenon of weather. It's sporadic. It can be geographically limited. As you know, as you're watching this video, we're in the midst of a crushing drought. Other parts of the country are suffering from torrential rainfalls. And so even though it's sporadic, it can be very intense in localized areas. And as I said earlier, droughts can affect wildlife species disproportionately. Some species can have slow, lingering impacts, while other species, like the waterfowl, can be subject to catastrophic disease outbreaks that can decimate populations. It can also affect wildlife behavior. Animals need water. People need water. What do we do to get water? How do we change our behavior in this drought to conserve water because we know we're going to need water in the future. Animals also have to change their behavior. They have to find water, and sometimes that puts them at risk for changing their behavior and going out of areas that they're normally comfortable with and know. And as I said, drought isn't, when we talk about wildlife, drought is an additive factor on an already stressed environment. 38 million people living in California. Wildlife are coming in conflict in a number of ways with people in the state, and drought is just another stress factor that's impacting our native species. Well, I want to get back to redwoods a little bit. Redwoods are a unique organism, and they're truly California. They're our state tree, and again, getting back to this notion of how they've responded to climate and how the drought is affecting them. So as I said, the climate has caused them to retreat back and hold on to the very edges of the North American continent. As this image shows you here, we find them in the fog belt, that narrow band of California where historically there has been lingering summer fog. As the fog comes up, it moves across the redwoods, the trees intercept the moisture, the fog drip falls to the ground. If you've ever been in any of the state parks in California on a foggy day, it's literally raining under the trees as the fog droplets are accumulating on the trees and then dripping down. Coast redwoods particularly are unique in that they don't have the ability to close their stomata. Stomata are these little valves on the undersides of leaves that open and close to regulate water transpiration in trees. Redwoods can't do that. They don't have to do that because they're enshrouded in fog. Their moisture and water needs are met during the summer because of the fog. They don't have to. They haven't evolved to have to conserve a lot of summer water. But they are reliant on summer fog. What we are seeing in California, particularly during these drought years, is that number of fog days has decreased along the coast. Long term, the climate is changing in California, and long term, the number of fog days is decreasing along the coast. So what's happening is, and even though it's insidious, as I said, we're not going to go out and find a whole bunch of dead redwood trees. These trees are under prolonged stress in the absence of fog. Over time, if this cycle should persist for a decade or longer, I would suspect that we would see some collapse of some of these redwood stands, particularly in the southern part of the range down by Santa Cruz and Monterey counties. Other organisms that live in the redwood forest that are dependent on fog and ambient moisture, atmospheric moisture, is a whole host of non-vascular plants. These little fuzzy things that grow on the trees, that are all dry and hard during the summer, these bryophytes, mosses and liverworts and the like. If you ever go out in the redwood forest after a rain, you notice that what were these dried, shriveled plants come to life in the winter months as they absorb water and start their reproductive activities. So again, these organisms are responding to available moisture, and that available moisture is allowing other insects and other aspects of the faunal community to become active, which is beneficial for other larger taxa, large animals that live in the forest. If we break down how a forest is used by wildlife, I put together this graph for you to show how different parts of a forest are used by different taxa. The taxa are amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and birds. If you look across, I've just picked some very obvious things that any of us can see when we go out on a walk. The riparian area is the streams, a rock pile, fallen logs, litter, just the amount of duff, accumulated duff on the forest floor in a redwood, and then snags, which are standing dead trees. As you can see, that birds are highly dependent on snags. There's a number of species of birds that have to live in dead trees to make cavities and carry out their young. But if you look at the riparian area, across all four of the taxa, the riparian areas, those stream corridors, are incredibly important for a whole host of organisms. And these are vertebrates. These are only animals with backbones. There's a whole bunch of animals that don't have backbones, invertebrates, that actually live in the water that are also dependent. So arguably, the riparian areas are the most biologically diverse and most biologically rich component of a forest. So when those stream corridors dry up, or water flows are depleted, or the water temperatures increase, it puts a stress on a whole host of different organisms that are reliant on that one part of the habitat throughout the year. And just to kind of give you a pretty picture here, all kids, it's always fun to go out after a heavy rain and take kids out and look for salamanders, whether they're ensitinas or maybe red-legged frogs. Newts, kids love newts. All of these organisms, giant Pacific salamander, all of these organisms are reliant on surface water to complete their life cycles. No water, no reproduction, no amphibians. It's really that simple. And sure, they can put it off for a year, but the longer they have to put it off, the more stress is put on their population, and eventually those populations will begin to decline. I want to talk a little bit about the other major plant community we have in California, and that's oak woodlands. And again, this notion I'm trying to get across here is that different plant communities respond in different ways to drought. Oak woodlands are very different than redwoods. They essentially live in a drought condition every summer, right? They've evolved in the Mediterranean climate. usually from what we're talking about, maybe May through September, October. It's hot and it's dry. They have adapted abilities to conserve water throughout those extremely dry months. They can close those little valves on the back of their leaves, those stomata, and they can hold on to water. Their leaves get very leathery, they get very tight. And if things get bad enough, they can actually start to drop leaves prematurely and just get rid of any abilities to transpire water. And again, all of this is an adaptation to a Mediterranean climate. They know that hot, dry, droughty summer is coming, and so over time, evolution has prepared them to address and adjust to the seasonality of California's interior valleys and mountains. That little bird down in the corner is a Wilson's warbler. Even though you'll find them out in the oak woodlands in the hot, dry part, it's one of the species that's riparian dependent. They do all of their nesting along riparian corridors in forests throughout California. Again, a breakdown of how animals in oak woodlands use different parts of the forest. All of us, when we think of oak woodlands, we immediately think of acorns and the importance of acorns. Well, certainly acorns are important for things like deer and mice, but I've never seen a newt try and choke down an acorn. They just don't eat them. But if you look at the riparian area here across the board, it is the most highly utilized part of the oak woodland forest, of the habitat that supports the highest number of taxa. It's that water thing. Water is an incredibly important source for all organisms in California. Let's spend a few minutes talking about pines, because I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about pine tree death this coming summer throughout California. Pines are incredibly susceptible to water stress, particularly those up in the Sierras where they should have lots of snow, lots of time-release water. In the presence of drought, pine trees are highly susceptible to various impacts. Usually what happens is as the trees become more and more stressed, there's a whole host of different bark beetles, 3, 4, 5 species of bark beetles that can attack these trees. These beetles are always attacking the trees, but under normal conditions, when a pine tree is vigorous and it has good sap flows, when the pine beetle tries to bore into the tree, the sap from the tree pushes the beetle out. It thwarts the attack. As water flows subside in the trees, there's less sap. Beetles are not pushed back. Beetles can make an entry into the tree. They develop their galleries. Those beetles come out, lay more eggs, have more beetles, and so on and so on. And it's an exponential increase in beetle numbers in a very short time. Over the last 3 years, this beetle population explosion has been building. And you can see the map on the right there is starting to show the conifer belt in the Sierras, where we're seeing significant pockets of mortality caused from beetles. So even though the beetles are killing the trees, the drought is what started the process that allows the beetles to get started and move forward. This cycle will persist even if the drought was to be broken in the next couple of years, simply because there are so many beetles out there, there are so many stressed trees in the Sierra. This is something we can expect to expand throughout the coming years. And the last system I want to talk about is this vernal pool system in California, a very unique, ephemeral, seasonal pools that pop up in certain geographic parts of the state. These images here, as you can see, are from the Sacramento Valley out in Solano County. There are vernal pools down in Southern California. There are vernal pools in the Mayacamas range of northwestern California, the coastal mountain range. These are short-term pools that fill up with water. They often have unique species associated with them, things like fairy shrimp, which actually live in these little pockets of water, and a whole host of botanical rarities that live only within these small seasonal pools. Also important for breeding sites for things like rough-skinned newts that'll come out of gopher holes. They've spent their whole summer down in a gopher hole or a ground squirrel hole. They wait for these pools to fill up. They come out and begin their breeding cycle. These little guys, these fairy shrimp, they erupt when the pools fill with water. They lay their eggs. The adults then die, and the eggs could sit in the soil for decades and wait for that pool to refill and start the life cycle again. Again, because of California's unique geographic situation, location, and all the tectonic activities we've had, all these little nooks and crannies, these variable habitats that we find, so many of them are dependent on water, and they're very different from one another. Obviously, this is very different from a pine forest, which is different from an oak forest, which is different from a redwood forest. But the common denominator in all of these plant communities and all of these ecological systems is water. They all need water to complete their life cycles. Here, again, here's a great example, and I can share a personal story with you. So western toads, ubiquitous species throughout California, where a toad is more adapted to hot and dry climates. We can find them in the interior part of the state. Certainly there's even some in the high desert regions of Southern California. But as drought tolerant as they are reliant on surface water to reproduce. They'll come together, they'll meet, the adults will reproduce, lay their eggs, and then there's tadpoles, pollywogs. Every kid in the world loves to chase pollywogs. Eventually the pollywogs or the tadpoles will grow feet, and they'll come out and start acting like real toads. Again, the personal story I'll share with you on my own property. I have a seasonal creek that comes across my property, and for 25 years that I've lived there, there's been western toads that breed in the creek during the late spring when there's water flow. For the last 3 years, that creek has had no water flow, so consequently, there's no breeding toad activity. In that 3 years, I've seen a noticeable decline in adult toads. It wasn't uncommon for me coming home from work and having to stop on my driveway and actually stop and pick up and move toads off the road so I wouldn't run them over. This winter, I only had to do that one time. There was one adult toad that I found on my property. What's happened is that the toads that have been on my property, mortality happens. They get old or they get picked off by something, and so over time, a population will begin to decline just from natural mortality. And in the absence of recruitment, in the absence of young of the year coming into the population every year, eventually that population will be extirpated. And I think that's what's happening on my property. I'm down to 1 or 2 toads where there used to be tens of toads running around. And this is that insidious nature of a drought. These small little local populations that are dependent on surface flow to complete an important part of their life cycle, in the absence of that, simply cannot sustain their populations and will eventually blink out. I just thought I'd throw a nice easy graph at you here. As I said, California environment, there are a number of stress factors that affect water in California. On the right-hand side, it's a simplified cumulative impacts assessment on a watershed. What we're talking about there is bank erosion and fine sediments getting into a stream and vegetation being removed along the side corridors, pollutants getting into the water, water getting too warm because there's not enough shade. Temperature is actually considered a pollutant. All of these things are working together, and as you add them up, they may have a cumulative impact on how a watershed functions, how those functions and flows that I talked about are able to provide the necessary ecological services to support wildlife species. All of these are going on all the time. All of our watersheds, whether from road building or timber harvest or agriculture or urbanization, all of these cumulative impacts are in place. Added on top of that is the drought. All of the cumulative impacts that are out there don't go away. The drought is just added, and it's another impact that adds another stress factor to a whole host of species. Again, where I come from, over in Mendocino and Lake counties, many of our coastal streams are seasonal. They're very flashy. After a storm, they'll start roaring, they'll get up to bank full, and then in a couple days, they're down to a trickle. The way California water works is that the system has to be recharged every winter. And what I'm talking about recharge is pretty much groundwater, but the rains in the wintertime recharge that system and allow those life cycle traits, life cycles to go forward in the spring when the creeks are full. And even though many of these species, especially on the coast, like these Clear Lake hitch that I've shown you here in this picture, even though their reproductive cycle time frames are very, very short, they get into the creeks and they get out fast because they know the creeks are going to dry out eventually. Even though their time frames are very compressed and they're very good and quick at what they do, they still need water. In the absence of water, no matter how quick these amphibians or many of these fish can get in and out of the creeks to reproduce, lay their eggs, and allow their young to hatch and move downstream and get to a main body of water, they still need water in order to do that. So just like the story I shared with you with the toads, these Clear Lake hitch have not spawned in the creek on my property for the last 3 years. And yet I know there are still these other mortality factors being put on them as they live out in Clear Lake and are having to deal with invasive species and the like. The other thing, the other component of water, not only that an animal has to live in it, many animals are reliant on water to migrate through it, to get from one part of their life cycle to the other. The best story that we all know is the story of California steelhead and salmon. Not only do the adults have to have free access and move upstream in order to lay their eggs, the juveniles need water long enough in the stream where they can get strong enough to swim out of the stream and get back down to the main stem and then eventually grow larger and then swim out to the ocean. So migration coming in is just as important as escapement or downward migration of juveniles as they get out to the ocean so that they can get big and come back and complete their life cycle. So the ability to move in water is also a function of water quantity. How much water is there? How long is the water in the system? Even though these magnificent animals can spawn in main stem rivers and streams, predation rates are higher, mortality rates are higher of the juveniles because the main stem streams have more predators. There's more risk factors where many of the small little seasonal streams lack these predators, lack these other stress factors, and there's a much better chance of survival for these organisms in these smaller streams, which do dry up, but as long as they dry up after the cycle is completed, it doesn't matter. Everything works out for the better. I mentioned briefly that water quantity equals water quality. You know, good, clean, cold water, we hear that a lot. It's important for aquatic organisms. The reason cold water is important is because cold water holds oxygen better than warm water. As water heats up, the oxygen molecules become agitated and they literally evaporate out of the water. So the warmer the water gets, the less oxygen it has in that water. Things like catfish and largemouth bass can tolerate warm water because their oxygen demand is less than things like trout or steelhead or salmon. They have a very high, intolerance for warm water as they need a lot of oxygen. So one of the things that is a concern in the drought situation is how reduced water flows are actually leading to increased temperatures, which is affecting water quality for many of these organisms. And then also the schematic on the right, you know, warm water, lack of water will affect the basis of the food web, if you will, all those little organisms that are part of the nutrient flow of a system, that are priming the system, that are feeding the system, everything from leaves that are able to decay and rot in water to the organisms that rip them apart and who are consumed by top-level predators. So, you know, all of these components are connected. They're not only connected by the physical presence of water, but of the condition of that water, the temperature of that water, and what is the function of that water in driving these various systems. And so, again, another way to just portray what I just mentioned is, you know, if we think of a food pyramid, top predators, in this case a western grebe, primary producers being algae and small singular cell plants, you know, at any one of those levels, if water conditions, water quality should negatively affect the producers or the primary consumers, well, those organisms that live higher up on the food chain will ultimately be affected. again, many times these don't happen overnight. These aren't catastrophic events, but it can be very insidious. Year after year, if primary productivity is reduced, then primary consumerism is reduced, and it goes up the food chain until eventually animals either have to leave. In the case of western grebes, they can get up and move and go somewhere else. Other species like western toads and newts and other amphibians don't have that ability. They simply fall out of the equation on a localized level. So as I said several times here today, is that drought is just another additive stress factor. The animals, the organisms that we have living in California are dealing with altered wildlife habitats from any host of reasons. Even our strong program of fire suppression has altered habitats by inhibiting the ability of decadent stands of brush to be rejuvenated and start at a lower seral stage and start that process over again. So there's lots of ways that we affect how habitat functions and how these functions and flows are affected. The picture on the right is just a typical California image. Heavy, dense urbanization on the left with some intermediate agriculture in between, and then wildlands going up through the hills. And the challenge, or one of the obvious concerns with drought, is animals that are living in this area, in order for them to live in these kinds of juxtapositioned habitats, different competing factors, different stress factors in close proximity to one another, they've migrated, they've figured out how to get through life and meet their basic needs. Well, in a severe drought like we have now, it could cause animals to change their normal behavior, to have to go beyond the boundaries of what they're comfortable with in search of water or in search of suitable food. And in the case here, here's a river otter that's been killed by a car. This is an animal you expect to be in a river or a lake, but if that river or lake or stream has dried up, it would force these animals to go do something that would be unusual for them to do, putting them at risk from unusual mortality factors. And we see this all the time as animals are displaced from lack of water and are trying to meet that basic need on a daily basis. So as I've said a number of times, the nature of a drought and its impacts on wildlife can be very insidious. It's very subtle. Here's an image up on the top of just a collection of road-killed frogs. And so, as I said earlier, mortality happens. Every day animals die, but that's part of how the system is intended to work. Nothing lives forever. But without the ability to recruit, without the ability of new juveniles to come into the population, if all you have is mortality in the absence of recruitment, eventually that local population could be lost. And in some species, like the tiger salamander down in the right-hand corner, where they've already, their habitat has been greatly restricted, they have some very unusual life traits of how they live and where they live. In the absence of their abilities to reproduce, species, and in the case of tiger salamander, a listed species, could be further imperiled by continued drought and the absence of surface water. So one of the things I've been asked to tell you is, what does the future hold? I wish I knew. I know if the future doesn't change as it relates to wildlife, it's not going to get any better. Certainly the demands of water in California, the conflicts between various user groups will only intensify, and the needs for animals for water will remain constant. Certainly there's concern that a prolonged drought could have lasting implications for a number of species. I was asked the other day, well, how do you mitigate for this? Well, across the state of California, to be honest with you, I don't know how you mitigate for all wildlife across California where the entire state is being impacted. We're talking about watersheds, we're talking about landscape level impacts. Certainly at a local level in your backyard, if you had a bird bath or any bowl of water, the birds or the animals in your backyard would certainly benefit. Can we do that across the state of California? I don't understand how we could do that. It's real simple. in the absence of water, wildlife will suffer. And as I said, depending on the geographic locations, as you can see there in the central part of the state, down by Monterey County, San Luis Obispo County, Santa Barbara County, that area is severely hurting right now. And those areas are in desperate need of some moisture next year, or as I said earlier, there will be local populations of susceptible species that could fade out of the picture. And the loss of those species would take years to recover as natural recruitment. Natural recovery would have to immigrate from outside the area. And again, it's one of the take-home messages I'd like to remind you of is that this drought is just one more stress on an already stressed system. It has an insidious impact on animals that are trying to live and share space with 38 million Californians. So with that, I hope I've given you something to think about. Certainly this is something I think about on a daily basis, and I thank you for your time.